There she is. All right. Okay. So let's go back and review the first two chapters. Chapter 1 started out with this great famine in the land of Judea, and which led Amalek and his family away from the promised land into the land of Moab. And if we remember, the land of Moab was like the tree of good and evil, the knowledge of good and evil. The fruit was delicious to the eye, but it was death to the soul. And in the land of Moab, when they get there, Amalek dies. He is survived by Naomi, his wife, and his two sons. His two sons in the land of Moab take Moab women as wives, and then 10 years later die childless, leaving the 3 grieving widows to fend for themselves. Then at that point, Naomi decides to return to the land of Bethlehem with her 2 daughters-in-laws. And one decides to stay, and Ruth, the other daughter-in-law, decides to go back to Bethlehem with Naomi. You see, Ruth here accepts the way and trusts God and his people while she goes home with Naomi. And chapter 1 ends with Ruth and Naomi back in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. You see, God was in the details of every moment there. Now we head into chapter 2, which I was calling the chapter of It Just So Happens. So now that they're back in Bethlehem, Ruth begins to gather grain to sustain them. And it just so happens that Ruth is gathering leftovers in a field owned by a man named Boaz. And yet it just so happens that there's a law in Israel that the poor were able to collect leftovers after the harvest was finished. And it just so happens that Ruth ended up at the exact field that Boaz was overseeing. It just so happens that you had the rich landowners in the fields with the poor still picking the grains that were left over. And it just so happens that Boaz runs into Ruth while she's harvesting grain in the field. You see, all these things just seem to happen. Yet we know that God was weaving all these things together because God is always in the details. You see, on the horizontal, things looked haphazard and crazy. Scary almost for Naomi and Ruth at the time. Yet on the vertical, they were providential. See, God was working all things out for their good. God, with all the wisdom and love, cares for and directs all things in the universe. He is in complete control over everything. He is sovereign over the universe as a whole, the physical world, the affairs of nations, human destiny, human success and failures, and protection of his people. You see, there's no such thing as luck, fate, or luck of the draw. Everything is ordained by God. It is through his providence that God accomplishes his will in us and for us. God works through the natural circumstances in this case, working all things out for their good. Which brings us to chapter 3, which I'm calling Redemption Assured, the right advice, the right event, the right man. So let's read together chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. It says, "Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Now Boaz, whose young woman you were with, is he not our relative? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Therefore wash yourself and anoint yourself. Put on your best garment and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies. And you shall go in, uncover his feet, and lay down. And he will tell you what you should do.' And she said to her, 'All that you say to me, I will do.'" You see, Boaz and Ruth's relationship has seemed to come to somewhat of a standstill. So Naomi makes this bold statement in the first verse saying, "Shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you?" The word security here in Hebrew means settled spot or place of rest. And this was referring to a marriage in this case. Naomi wanted Ruth to be settled and secure in a home with a husband, much like Christ is our security today. Then Naomi suggests Boaz to Ruth. After all, he is a relative. And if we remember that Naomi made mention to the fact that Boaz was a close relative back in chapter 2, verse 20. I mean, why did she bring it up here, and what's going on here? Why would Ruth want to marry a relative? Boaz could be what's called the kinsman redeemer, which is a relative who functions on behalf of the family for their property and the family circle in a time of crisis. Boaz could redeem the property, purchasing what had been lost, and return it to the one who was forced to sell it. He could also, in turn, fulfill the Levirate marriage clause. The Levirate marriage provided for a childless widow to marry an available brother for her deceased husband, to raise up children in her deceased husband's name. If a brother wasn't available, then the next of kin could marry her. And Boaz could fill both of these roles. Not only to serve as a redeemer for the family, but also to marry Ruth and raise up children for her deceased husband. The name would not be lost forever. But you see, Boaz's hands were tied in the matter of marrying Ruth at this moment. It was not up to him. He could not claim her as his wife. It was up to Ruth to make the move. Seeing that interest was developing between both Ruth and Boaz, Naomi took a bold move to suggest to Ruth to claim Boaz as her redeemer and request marriage. So Naomi instructs Ruth to fix herself up, to move from the grieving widow to the ready to mingle and go up to the threshing floor, where Boaz was celebrating his harvest tonight. We may be asking ourselves, what is a threshing floor? Well, the threshing floor was a place where they brought the barley. It was up on a hill, and on that hill was patted down clay in a circular formation. And they would put the bundles of the barley down, and the oxen would trample it. And they would take pitchforks like tools and throw it up in the air, and the chaff would spread out, and the grain would fall to the ground. And they would do this consistently until the wind died down. And since the threshing floor was circular formation, it was typical for the men at the end of the night to put their heads against the circle and their feet out, much like a spoke. They slept that way to protect the grain from any thieves that might come in to steal. So now Naomi's final instruction to Ruth says that you should notice where Boaz goes to lay down and uncover his feet. So now we see Ruth in complete submission to all of God's ways shown here, when she says, "All that you say, I will do." Ruth was brought into the culture and the practices of new people, the laws of God, and without question agrees to follow the ways of God. And in the same way, we are too to prepare ourselves for the Lord. Have you ever taken advice from someone? And has that advice been different between a believer and a non-believer? You see, Ruth took advice from Naomi. She was a godly woman. Ruth didn't question her motives, nor what she was saying. Naomi didn't give her the chicken soup for the soul book, or how to find an Israelite husband in 30 days. Naomi knew that God would bring forth a redeemer, the family, bring forth a redeemer for the family, if it was his will. Ruth knew that Naomi was a woman of God, and her advice was not of the world, but the advice was of God. She knew that she had her best interests in mind and wanted to find security for her under a husband and under the Lord. So now we've come to the point where Ruth is getting herself put together. She is transitioning from grieving of death to celebrating life. She is preparing herself to propose to Boaz, going up to the threshing floor for the festival. She has Naomi's instructions fresh in her mind. And next we're going to see the event that took place and what's going to happen at this festival. So let's read together verses 6 through 13. It says, "So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had instructed her. And after Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she came softly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Now it happened at midnight. The man was startled and turned himself, and there a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" She answered, "I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative." Then he said, "Blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, and in that you did not go after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request. For all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman. Now it is true that I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Stay the night, and in the morning it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a close relative for you, good, let him do it. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I will perform the duty for you as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning." So Ruth, making good on her promise to Naomi, goes up to the threshing floor to carry out all of Naomi's instructions. First, she watches Boaz eat and drink until it says his heart was cheerful. You see, a big weight was lifted off of his shoulders. Boaz was satisfied with the work that was accomplished. He was content and at peace with himself and with God. He knew that Yahweh blessed him with a full and great harvest. And after a long, hard day of work, he goes and lies down. And we can assume that some time has passed since he's laid down and from the time that Ruth went up to uncover his feet. You see, Ruth takes notice to where Boaz was sleeping and comes and literally uncovers his feet and lays underneath of him. This was a complete act of submission by Ruth. Have you ever had cold feet at night? It'll definitely wake you up. And you got to cover them back up. But could you imagine finding a woman laying under your feet at night? He asks, "Who are you?" She answers, "I am Ruth, your maidservant. So spread your covering over your maidservant, for you are a close relative." You see, what she says here is so significant to the story. When Ruth says to Boaz, "Spread your covering over me," the Hebrew word here was the same word used in chapter 2, verse 12, speaking of the wings of God. Ruth has recognized Boaz as the agent of God's providence. God will use Boaz to answer his own prayer, as he did in chapter 2. Boaz is God's wing of protection for her. So in basic terms, Ruth is saying, "I want you to marry me." And Boaz